Welcome back. Today we're exploring one of history's most challenging periods, the Dark Ages, roughly 500 to 1000 CE. Instead of focusing on kings and nobles, we're uncovering how medieval peasants, who made up over 90% of the population, survived centuries of hardship, disease, famine, and uncertainty. These were real people with incredible will to survive against overwhelming odds. They faced plagues that wiped out villages, famines lasting years, brutal winters, and a social system designed to keep them in servitude. Yet they persevered. We'll explore their daily lives, how they fought starvation during Europe's worst famines, the diseases that terrorized communities, and the survival strategies that kept humanity going through its darkest chapter. This is their story. Survival against impossible odds. Picture dawn in 850 CE. A peasant family wakes before the rooster crows. Their one-room home was built from timber, wattle, and daub, mud mixed with straw and dung. The thatched roof had one hole serving as both chimney and window, forcing a choice between light and warmth. The packed earth floor was sometimes covered with rushes. Furniture meant a rough table, stools, and straw sleeping pallets. Privacy didn't exist. Parents, children, grandparents, and livestock shared this space. The family pig wasn't just livestock. It was a roommate providing warmth. Water collection was the first daily challenge. Clean water was never guaranteed. Women and children made multiple trips with clay vessels, preferring running streams over stagnant ponds. Medieval people understood that certain water sources meant sickness and death. The hearth was literally life and death. Keeping fire going was constant concern, because starting new fires required precious flint, steel, and tinder. Many families maintained fires continuously for months, banking coals nightly and nurturing them each morning. Losing the fire could mean death in winter. Food preparation began before dawn. Women ground grain using stone querns, back-breaking work taking hours for one day's flour. The grain was often mixed with acorns, chestnuts, or beans. Pure wheat was for nobility. Peasants used barley, oats, or rye combinations. Bread was dense, dark, and gritty from stone particles. Single loaves lasted days, softened by soaking in weak ale or herb water. Ale was safer than water. Fermentation killed bacteria. Even children drank weak ale daily as survival necessity. Labor division was absolute from childhood. Boys helped with field work and learned to handle oxen. Girls learned spinning, weaving, and food preparation. By 12, children contributed significantly to family survival. Their education was harsh reality. Clothing was purely functional. Peasants owned two outfits, work clothes and church clothes. Garments were rough wool or linen, sewn and repaired until they disintegrated. Shoes were wooden clogs or leather boots resoled repeatedly. Personal hygiene was limited but not ignored. They bathed in streams when possible and understood cleanliness helped prevent illness. The agricultural year controlled every aspect of peasant existence. Medieval farming wasn't just agriculture. It was complex survival strategy developed over centuries of famines and failures. Spring brought hope and terror. Hope meant winter's end. Terror because previous year's decisions faced harsh judgment. If they'd eaten too much seed grain during winter, nothing could be planted. If they'd slaughtered too many animals, insufficient manure remained for fertilizer. Ploughing began when ground thawed. Peasants used wooden ploughs pulled by shared oxen, precious animals representing survival itself. Losing an ox to disease meant potential family doom. The three-field system was revolutionary survival strategy. Instead of farming all land yearly and exhausting soil, peasants divided holdings into thirds: winter crops, spring crops, and fallow recovery land. This reduced total crop failure risk and maintained fertility, but meant 1/3 produced nothing annually. Seed grain represented ultimate survival dilemma. Every planted grain couldn't be eaten immediately, but without planting, no future harvest existed. Families calculated precisely: survival needs until next harvest, lord's rent, seed requirements, and church tithes. These calculations determined life or death. Growing season meant constant anxiety. No weather forecasting, crop insurance, or assistance existed. Too much rain rotted crops, too little caused drought. Hail destroyed months of work instantly. Late frost killed young plants. Peasants developed intricate understanding of local patterns, soil conditions, and rotation techniques. They planted multiple varieties, spreading risk. If one failed, others might survive. Staggered planting meant single weather events couldn't destroy everything. Harvest was the year's most critical period. Entire communities worked together because timing was everything. Grain needed cutting at perfect moments. Too early meant underdevelopment. Too late meant spoilage. Every family member participated, racing against weather and time. Tools were simple but effective. Sickles for cutting, flails for threshing, winnowing baskets for separation. These were carefully maintained and passed through generations. Broken sickles during harvest meant disaster. Storage required sophisticated techniques. Granaries were elevated structures keeping grain dry and protecting from rodents. Peasants identified spoilage signs and developed preservation using salt, smoke, and temperature control. Kitchen gardens supplemented diets with vegetables providing essential nutrients. Cabbages, onions, beans, and peas grew in small spaces and stored through winter. These often meant the difference between health and scurvy. Root vegetables were particularly valuable because underground cellars kept them fresh for months. Turnips, parsnips, and carrots survived winter storage when properly managed. Animal husbandry presented different challenges. Peasants owned few chickens, maybe a pig, possibly a cow or goat. These provided protein, but competed with humans for food. Winter meant agonizing choices between feeding animals or family. Pigs were especially valuable. Foraging in forests for acorns and scraps humans couldn't digest. They efficiently converted waste into protein with less care than larger animals. The seasonal rhythm meant constant future thinking. Spring meant planting for summer harvest. Summer meant preparing for winter. Winter meant planning next spring. This long-term perspective was essential but created constant uncertainty about survival. Famine wasn't occasional tragedy. It was recurring nightmare shaping every peasant decision. Understanding famine's survival reveals human resilience depths and desperate survival lengths. Weather was the most common cause. Cold, wet summers destroyed crops across regions. The medieval warm period ended around 1300, bringing cooler, wetter weather, making agriculture difficult. Warfare could prevent planting or harvesting, with armies deliberately destroying crops. Sometimes grain existed but couldn't reach people needing it. Medieval transportation was primitive. Ox carts over terrible roads or boats along rivers. Bridge collapse or closed roads could cut off entire communities. Early warning signs were subtle but terrifying. Grain prices would rise in markets. Nobles started hoarding food. Beggars appeared on roads from affected areas. These signs gave precious preparation time. But options were limited. When famine struck, families had survival strategy hierarchies. First, they reduced portions and eliminated non-essential foods. Meat became memory, vegetables were rationed, bread portions shrank. Families watered down ale and stretched soups. Second phase involved consuming foods normally reserved for animals. Peasants knew which plants were edible if unpalatable. Acorns could be ground into flour after extensive processing to remove bitter tannins. Tree bark, particularly birch and pine, could be dried and ground to extend bread flour. Root vegetables normally saved for next year's seed became emergency food. Peasants dug up every edible root, wild onions, garlic, carrots, and various tubers growing wild in forests. Third phase was most desperate, consuming dangerous or taboo foods. Peasants ate diseased animals, knowing this could cause illness. They consumed moldy or spoiled grains, hoping cooking would make them safe. Some ate clay or dirt, providing no nutrition, but filling empty stomachs. During worse famines, social bonds broke down. Families abandoned elderly relatives who couldn't contribute. Parents might sell children into slavery or abandon them in monasteries, hoping monks could keep them alive. Physical effects were devastating. First came constant hunger and weakness. Then muscles wasted as bodies consumed their own protein. Skin became thin and bruised easily. Hair fell out, teeth loosened. Wounds healed slowly or not at all. Children were particularly vulnerable because growing bodies needed more nutrition relative to size. Pregnant women faced impossible choices. Bodies would prioritize the fetus, often at their own health's cost. Psychological effects were equally severe. Constant hunger affected clear thinking and good decisions. Depression and despair were common as people watched communities slowly die. Some turned to religious extremism, believing famine was divine punishment. However, peasants also developed remarkable mutual aid strategies. Communities shared dwindling resources according to need rather than ownership. Families took in orphan children even when barely feeding their own. Villages organized collective hunts or expeditions searching for edible plants. Recovery from famine was slow and dangerous. When food became available, starving people had to resist eating too much too quickly, which could be fatal. Digestive systems had adapted to minimal intake, and sudden abundance could cause serious illness. The demographic impact was enormous. Entire villages could be abandoned as people died or fled. Population levels plummeted and took decades to recover. Survivors were often permanently weakened and traumatized. Medieval peasants developed cultural mechanisms for remembering and preparing for famines. Oral traditions preserved knowledge about edible wild plants and safe processing methods. Folk songs reminded people of warning signs. These famine survival strategies reveal incredible peasant knowledge about their environment and bodies. Disease was medieval peasants' most feared enemy, striking without warning. Unlike famine with warning signs, illness could transform healthy people into corpses within days. Understanding peasant disease fighting reveals remarkable herbal knowledge, sophisticated contagion understanding, and incredible resilience against medical helplessness. Medieval Europe's disease environment was brutal beyond modern comprehension. Smallpox, measles, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various fevers circulated constantly. These weren't rare epidemics. They were background noise claiming lives regularly. Smallpox was particularly terrifying because it was deadly and disfiguring. Peasants learned to recognize early symptoms: fever, headache, back pain. Knowing red spots on tongue and mouth meant disaster. Disease spread rapidly through families, often killing 30% of infected and leaving survivors permanently scarred or blind. The plague, the Black Death, truly terrorized medieval Europe. When it struck in the 14th century, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Peasants were particularly vulnerable because they lived close to rats and fleas carrying disease, and poor nutrition made them less able to fight infection. Medieval peasants developed a remarkably accurate understanding of disease spread without knowledge of germs. They observed certain diseases pass through close contact, while others seemed to come from bad air or contaminated water. They learned to quarantine sick family members when possible and avoid contact with symptomatic people. However, quarantine was often impossible in peasant homes, where families shared single rooms. When one person became sick, everyone was exposed. Peasants learned to recognize early symptoms and would sometimes send sick family members to isolated huts to prevent infection spread. Peasant women became skilled herbalists through necessity, learning to identify, gather, and prepare medicinal plants. This knowledge passed through generations of women and represented their most valuable survival skills. They knew which herbs reduced fever, fought infection, eased pain, and helped with childbirth. Willow bark was widely used for pain relief and fever reduction. It contains salicin, chemically related to aspirin. Echinacea was used to boost immune function. Garlic was eaten regularly because peasants observed it seemed to prevent certain illnesses. Honey was applied to wounds because it had antiseptic properties. Many herbs addressed digestive problems, common due to poor diet and contaminated food. Chamomile tea treated stomach upset, peppermint helped nausea, and bitter herbs stimulated appetite in sick people. Peasants understood maintaining nutrition was crucial for illness recovery. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous times in medieval women's lives. Without modern medical care, labor complications could easily prove fatal for mother, child, or both. Peasant women developed elaborate childbirth traditions, including specific herbs, positions, and procedures designed to improve survival rates. Midwives were crucial community figures, women who learned through experience how to assist difficult births. They knew techniques for turning breached babies, herbs stimulating labor contractions, and methods for stopping excessive bleeding. However, success rates were limited, and many women died despite their efforts. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. As many as 50% of children died before age 5. Peasants learned not to become too emotionally attached to newborns because survival chances were poor. Children surviving infancy still faced constant threats from disease, malnutrition, and accidents. Foodborne illnesses were common, especially during warm weather when meat and dairy spoiled quickly. Peasants learned to identify spoiled food by smell, appearance, and taste. They developed preservation techniques using salt, smoke, and fermentation that extended storage and made food safer. Ergotism was particularly horrifying, caused by eating grain contaminated with ergot fungus. The fungus grew on rye during wet weather, and consuming it caused hallucinations, convulsions, and often death. Peasants called it saint, Anthony's fire, because victims felt like burning from inside. Mental illness was poorly understood, but widely recognized. Peasants distinguished between different types of mental disturbance, some attributed to brain injuries, others to supernatural causes. People with mental illness were sometimes cared for by families, sometimes abandoned, sometimes killed, as demon-possessed. Pain management was a constant challenge without effective anesthetics. people endured incredible suffering from injuries, diseases, and medical procedures. They used alcohol, opium poppies when available, and various herbs to dull pain, though these were often inadequate. Dental problems were nearly universal. Coarse diet wore down teeth quickly, and lack of dental care led to painful infections and tooth loss. Many people lost most teeth by middle age, making eating difficult and contributing to malnutrition. Despite these challenges, medieval peasants showed remarkable disease-fighting resilience. Communities banded together caring for sick members, sharing food and medicine when resources were scarce. They developed sophisticated networks for sharing medical knowledge and traveled considerable distances to consult known healers. During outbreaks, the disease spread so quickly that entire villages could be affected within weeks. Children would develop high fevers, coughs, and the characteristic red rash. Many died from secondary infections or complications like pneumonia. But it was the plague, the Black Death, that truly terrorized medieval Europe. When it struck in the 14th century, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Peasants were particularly vulnerable because they lived in close proximity to rats and fleas that carried the disease, and their poor nutrition made them less able to fight infection. The plague came in 3 forms, each with its own horrible characteristics. Bubonic plague caused massive, painful swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes. Septicemic plague infected the bloodstream, causing internal bleeding and turning the skin black. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through coughing and breathing. Medieval peasants developed remarkably accurate understanding of how diseases spread, even without knowledge of germs or bacteria. They observed that certain diseases passed from person to person through close contact, while others seemed to come from bad air or contaminated water. They learned to quarantine sick family members when possible and to avoid contact with people showing symptoms of contagious diseases. However, quarantine was often impossible in peasant homes, where entire families shared single rooms. When one person became sick, everyone was exposed. Peasants learned to recognize the early symptoms of various diseases and would sometimes send sick family members to isolated huts or caves to prevent the spread of infection to others. Peasant women became skilled herbalists through necessity, learning to identify, gather, and prepare medicinal plants. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women and represented one of their most valuable survival skills. They knew which herbs could reduce fever, which could fight infection, which could ease pain, and which could help with childbirth. Willow bark was widely used for pain relief and fever reduction. It contains salicin, which is chemically related to aspirin. Echinacea was used to boost immune function. Garlic was eaten regularly because peasants observed that it seemed to prevent certain types of illness. Honey was applied to wounds because it had antiseptic properties, though peasants didn't understand why it worked. Many herbs were used for digestive problems, which were common due to poor diet and contaminated food. Chamomile tea was used for stomach upset, peppermint for nausea, and various bitter herbs to stimulate appetite in sick people. Peasants understood that maintaining nutrition was crucial for recovery from illness. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous times in a medieval woman's life. Without modern medical care, complications during labor could easily prove fatal for mother, child, or both. Peasant women developed elaborate traditions around childbirth, including specific herbs, positions, and procedures designed to improve survival rates. Midwives were crucial figures in peasant communities, women who had learned through experience how to assist with difficult births. They knew techniques for turning breached babies, herbs that could stimulate labor contractions, and methods for stopping excessive bleeding. However, their success rate was limited, and many women died in childbirth despite their best efforts. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. As many as 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. Peasants learned not to become too emotionally attached to newborns because the chances of survival were so poor. Children who survived infancy still faced constant threats from disease, malnutrition, and accidents. The lack of understanding about germs and sanitation made disease prevention difficult. But peasants did develop some effective practices. They learned that certain water sources were safer than others and would travel considerable distances to obtain clean water. They observed that people who bathed regularly seemed to stay healthier, though cold temperatures and lack of privacy made frequent bathing difficult. Foodborne illnesses were common, especially during warm weather when meat and dairy products spoiled quickly. Peasants learned to identify spoiled food by smell, appearance, and taste. They developed preservation techniques using salt, smoke, and fermentation that not only extended food storage but also made it safer to eat. Ergotism was a particularly horrifying disease caused by eating grain contaminated with ergot fungus. The fungus grew on rye and other grains during wet weather, and consuming it caused hallucinations, convulsions, and often death. Peasants called it Saint Anthony's fire because victims felt like they were burning from the inside. They learned to inspect grain carefully and discard any that showed signs of fungal contamination. Mental illness was poorly understood, but widely recognized. Peasants distinguished between different types of mental disturbance. Some they attributed to brain injuries, others to supernatural causes. People with mental illness were sometimes cared for by their families, sometimes abandoned, and sometimes killed as being possessed by demons. The church played a significant role in medieval medicine, though this was often more harmful than helpful. Religious healing relied heavily on prayer, relics, and pilgrimages to holy sites. While this provided psychological comfort, it often delayed or replaced more effective treatments. Some church officials actively discouraged the use of herbal medicine, considering it witchcraft. However, monasteries also preserved and transmitted medical knowledge from ancient sources. Monks copied medical texts, maintained herb gardens, and sometimes provided medical care to the poor. Some monasteries became centers of medical learning, though this knowledge was often mixed with religious superstition. Pain management was a constant challenge for medieval peasants. Without effective anesthetics, people had to endure incredible suffering from injuries, diseases, and medical procedures. They used alcohol, opium poppies when available, and various herbs to dull pain, but these were often inadequate for serious conditions. Dental problems were nearly universal among medieval peasants. Their coarse diet wore down teeth quickly, and lack of dental care led to painful infections and tooth loss. Many people lost most of their teeth by middle age, making eating difficult and contributing to malnutrition. Peasants learned to soften hard foods and modify their diets to accommodate dental problems. Surgery was primitive and extremely dangerous. Most surgical procedures were performed by barbers or other non-medical practitioners using crude instruments and no anesthesia. The mortality rate from surgery was so high that it was usually attempted only as a last resort. Simple procedures like setting broken bones or removing foreign objects from wounds had better success rates than complex operations. The psychological impact of living with constant disease and death was profound. Medieval peasants developed a fatalistic attitude toward illness and death, accepting them as inevitable parts of life. This acceptance helped them cope psychologically. but may have also discouraged them from seeking treatment or taking preventive measures. Despite these challenges, medieval peasants showed remarkable resilience in fighting disease. Communities would band together to care for sick members, sharing food and medicine even when resources were scarce. They developed sophisticated networks for sharing medical knowledge and would travel considerable distances to consult with known healers. The survival of any peasant family through multiple disease outbreaks was largely a matter of luck, but those who survived often developed some immunity to common diseases. This natural selection process meant that medieval populations gradually became more resistant to endemic diseases, though they remained vulnerable to new infections introduced through trade or warfare. Survival for medieval peasants wasn't just about food and disease. It was about navigating a social system designed to extract maximum value from their labor while providing minimal protection. Understanding their social survival reveals remarkable ability to find agency within oppression and create mutual support networks despite overwhelming inequality. The feudal system was theoretically based on mutual obligation. Peasants worked land and provided military service in exchange for protection. In reality, it was exploitation keeping peasants in perpetual poverty and servitude. Lords owned land, mills, ovens, even rivers and forests. Peasants owned virtually nothing except their labor. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to land they worked. They couldn't leave without lord's permission, couldn't marry without approval, and paid various fees consuming much of their production. The Heriot tax required families to give their best animal when household head died. Even death wasn't free. Families owed money to bury dead in consecrated ground. Despite crushing obligations, peasants developed strategies for maintaining life control. They learned legal systems well enough to defend rights when possible. Manor court records show peasants successfully arguing cases, defending property rights, and occasionally winning disputes against social superiors. The most common survival strategy was making themselves valuable enough that lords couldn't afford excessive abuse. Skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, millers had more negotiating power than ordinary field workers. Peasants invested enormous effort developing specialized skills, making them indispensable. Marriage was crucial survival strategy, carefully regulated by lords and church. Peasants balanced personal preferences with economic necessity and legal requirements. Good marriages could improve family economics, provide additional labor, and create valuable alliances. Bad marriages could mean disaster. Peasant women had fewer legal rights than men, but wielded considerable informal power within families and communities. They controlled food preparation, child rearing, and often managed household finances. Women's work was essential: spinning thread, weaving cloth, brewing ale, tending gardens, providing medical care. Men without wives faced serious survival disadvantages. Children were economic assets from early age, but also investments in family futures. Parents balanced immediate value of children's labor against long-term benefits of keeping them healthy and possibly providing useful skill training. Deciding which children to invest in was one of parents' most difficult choices. Extended family networks were crucial for survival. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins provided mutual support during crises. When parents died, relatives took in orphan children. When crops failed, families shared whatever resources they had. These networks were carefully maintained through regular contact and mutual assistance. Village communities developed sophisticated mutual aid and collective action systems. Peasants worked together during harvest, shared expensive tools and equipment, and provided labor for major projects like building houses or clearing land. They also policed themselves, maintaining social order through gossip, shame, and occasional violence. The church provided both comfort and additional burden. Religious services offered psychological relief from daily hardships and promised better afterlife things. However, the church also demanded tithes, typically 10% of production, and various fees for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Peasants had limited social mobility options, but some opportunities existed. The church offered one path. Intelligent young men could sometimes become priests or rise higher in religious hierarchy. Military service during wartime could occasionally lead to advancement, though more likely to death or injury. The legal system, while heavily biased against peasants, did provide some protections. Lords couldn't simply kill peasants without cause, and manor courts sometimes ruled in peasants' favor in disputes. Peasants learned to use legal systems strategically, filing complaints and appeals when they felt wronged. Education was extremely limited, but peasants developed sophisticated oral traditions preserving crucial survival knowledge. Stories, songs, and proverbs transmitted information about everything from weather prediction to herbal medicine. These traditions also provided entertainment and helped maintain community bonds during long winter evenings. Season rhythms controlled medieval peasant life with intensity modern people can barely comprehend. Each season brought survival challenges, opportunities, and life or death decisions. Understanding these cycles reveals how peasants planned existence around natural world and developed sophisticated strategies for surviving nature's extremes. Spring arrived as salvation and trial. After months surviving on stored food, families were often down to last supplies when weather warmed. This period was the hunger gap. Dangerous weeks between winter stores ending and first fresh food appearing. Many peasants died during these critical weeks, bodies too weakened by winter to reach spring abundance. First, edible spring plants were desperately anticipated. Wild garlic, dandelion greens, nettle tops provided crucial nutrition and helped prevent scurvy after months of limited diet. Peasant women knew exactly when and where to find these plants, and knowledge of safe versus poisonous plants could mean life or death for families. Spring meant resuming intensive agricultural work after winter's relative rest. Fields needed ploughing, seeds planted, gardens established. This required enormous physical effort from people often weakened by winter privations. Peasants carefully balanced energy expenditure against limited food supplies. Weather during spring planting was crucial and completely beyond control. Late frost could kill newly planted crops, requiring replanting with precious reserve seeds. Too much rain delayed planting past optimal windows. Too little rain prevented proper seed germination. Peasants watched skies constantly and made difficult planting decisions based on generational weather knowledge. Summer brought challenges despite being generally most abundant time. Intense physical labor, maintaining crops, tending animals, and preparing for winter consumed enormous energy. Peasants worked dawn to dusk during longest days, knowing winter survival depended on summer productivity. Heat-related illnesses were common among peasants working in blazing sun, while wearing heavy clothing and lacking adequate water. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke could be fatal. But peasants had no choice but continuing work regardless of weather. Water management became critical during summer. Wells could run dry, streams could become contaminated, and waterborne disease risk increased significantly. Peasants balanced water needs against drinking from questionable sources, learning to identify contamination signs and developing purification techniques. Food preservation was constant summer activity as peasants prepared for lean months ahead. They dried vegetables and fruits, salted meat, fermented dairy products, and stored grains in carefully constructed granaries. Every decision about immediate consumption versus preservation could determine winter survival. Harvest time in late summer and early autumn was the year's most critical period. Everything depended on successfully gathering, processing, and storing crops. Entire communities worked together. Understanding individual survival depended on collective success. Even elderly or disabled members contributed whatever possible. Autumn was intense winter preparation time. Animals that couldn't be fed through winter had to be slaughtered, and meat preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Decisions about which animals to keep alive versus slaughter were emotionally difficult, but economically essential. Wood gathering was another crucial autumn activity. Peasants needed enormous firewood quantities for heating homes and cooking food during long winter months. Competition for good wood was fierce, and peasants balanced energy required to gather and transport wood against its winter survival necessity. Winter was the ultimate test of peasant survival strategies. Everything done during previous seasons would be judged by whether they could stay alive until spring returned. Cold was relentless and potentially fatal. Peasants maintained fires constantly while carefully rationing fuel supplies. Food rationing during winter required careful calculation and strong discipline. Peasants made stored supplies last potentially 6 months or more, never knowing exactly when spring would arrive. They ate smaller portions, stretched food with fillers, and saved most nutritious items for coldest periods when bodies needed most energy. Winter's psychological challenges were as dangerous as physical ones. Months of confinement in small, dark spaces with inadequate food and constant cold could drive people to despair. Depression and anxiety were common, and some peasants didn't survive mental stress even with adequate physical resources. The seasonal cycle taught valuable survival lessons, but reminded peasants of complete dependence on forces beyond their control. Weather, climate, disease, and warfare could disrupt carefully laid plans and doom entire communities. Yet through skill, luck, and incredible determination, enough peasants survived each year to continue the cycle. Medieval peasant survival wasn't individual or family endeavor. It was fundamentally community enterprise. Harsh medieval realities made cooperation essential, and peasants developed sophisticated mutual aid systems, collective labor, and shared resources that often meant difference between survival and death for entire villages. Villages were organized around survival needs rather than convenience. Houses clustered together for mutual protection and assistance, with common areas for shared activities like grain processing and animal husbandry. Village layouts reflected centuries of experience about arrangements that best supported community survival. Collective labor was essential for survival tasks beyond individual family capability. Harvesting had to be completed quickly before weather destroyed crops, requiring entire communities working together. House construction needed multiple families providing labor, materials, and expertise. Clearing new farmland from forests required coordinated effort from many people over extended periods. The three-field agricultural system couldn't function without community cooperation. Decisions about what to plant where and when required collective agreement and coordination. Communities had to manage shared resources like common pastures, woodlands, and water sources. Disputes over shared resources had to be resolved peacefully, or entire communities could suffer. Tool and equipment sharing was crucial. because most families couldn't afford to own all needed implements. Expensive items like plows, oxen, and mill equipment were shared among multiple families according to complex schedules and agreements. This required high trust and cooperation levels, as family survival might depend on neighbors properly maintaining and returning shared equipment. During crises, community survival networks became even more important. When individual families faced disaster through crop failure, disease, or breadwinner death, communities would rally to provide support. Orphan children would be taken in by relatives or neighbors. Widows would receive help with heavy labor and protection from exploitation. The church played central roles in organizing community survival efforts, though often mixed with religious obligations draining community resources. Church buildings served as meeting places where community decisions were made and disputes resolved. Religious festivals provided opportunities for community bonding and mutual aid. Village leadership was typically informal but crucial for survival. Respected elders, successful farmers, and skilled craftsmen emerged as leaders who could organize collective efforts and mediate disputes. These leaders balanced competing interests while ensuring community decisions supported overall survival. Women played crucial but often informal roles in community survival networks. They shared knowledge about childbirth, herbal medicine, and food preparation. They organized mutual aid for families in crisis and maintained social relationships, holding communities together. Women's work was often collaborative, gathering to spin thread, preserve food, and care for children collectively. Children were integrated into community survival efforts from early age. They served as messengers between families, helped with collective labor projects, and learned essential skills from multiple adults in the community. Entire villages had stakes in raising children successfully because they represented future community survival. Marriage was community institution as much as personal one. Marriages created alliances between families and integrated individuals into broader survival networks. Communities had interests in ensuring marriages were economically viable and socially stable. Wedding celebrations were community investments in new family unit success. Conflict resolution was essential for community survival because internal disputes could destroy cooperation necessary for everyone's survival. Villages developed elaborate procedures for mediating disagreements, assigning blame, and repairing damaged relationships. Exile from community was severe punishment because it usually meant death for individuals who couldn't survive alone. Shared knowledge was perhaps the most valuable community resource. Information about weather patterns, crop varieties, animal husbandry, and survival techniques was accumulated over generations and shared freely within communities. This knowledge was preserved through oral traditions, apprenticeship systems, and collective memory maintained by elder community members. Economic cooperation was essential because no individual family could produce everything needed for survival. Peasants specialized in different skills and traded products and services within communities. Blacksmiths provided tools, millers processed grain, and various craftsmen created essential items families couldn't make themselves. Communities also served as social safety nets for individuals who couldn't work due to age, disability, or illness. While resources were limited, villages typically tried to keep all members alive rather than abandoning the weak. This wasn't just compassion. It was recognition that anyone might someday need community support for survival. As we reach the end of our journey through the daily struggles and remarkable resilience of medieval peasants, it's worth reflecting on what their survival strategies reveal about human adaptability, community cooperation, and the will to persevere against overwhelming odds. Medieval peasants faced challenges that would crush most modern people within weeks. They lived with constant uncertainty about food, water, shelter, and safety. Disease could strike without warning, famine could last for years, and social oppression was a daily reality. Yet somehow, they not only survived, but maintained families, communities, and cultural traditions that would eventually evolve into the modern world we know today. Their survival wasn't accidental or simply a matter of luck. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated knowledge systems about agriculture, medicine, weather prediction, food preservation, and social cooperation. They understood their environment in ways that modern people, insulated by technology, can barely comprehend. They could read the sky for weather signs, identify dozens of edible and medicinal plants, and manage complex agricultural systems without any of the tools we consider essential. Perhaps most remarkably, they maintained hope and humanity despite conditions that would seem to justify despair. They celebrated births, mourned deaths, told stories, sang songs, and found joy in small pleasures. They cared for their elderly, raised their children with love, and maintained social bonds that made survival possible for entire communities. The peasant survival strategies we've explored reveal several key principles that remained constant throughout the medieval period. First, diversification was essential. Peasants never depended on a single source of food, income, or security. They planted multiple crops, maintained various food sources, and developed diverse skills that could be applied in different situations. Second, community cooperation was absolutely crucial. No individual or family could survive alone in the medieval world. Mutual aid, shared resources, and collective labor made survival possible for groups even when it would have been impossible for individuals. The social bonds that held communities together were as important as physical resources for ensuring survival. Third, peasants understood the importance of planning for the future while adapting to present circumstances. They thought in seasonal cycles and annual patterns, while remaining flexible enough to respond to unexpected challenges. This long-term thinking, combined with tactical adaptability, allowed them to survive both predictable hardships and sudden crises. Fourth, they developed remarkable knowledge about their natural environment and their own bodies. This knowledge was empirical, tested through generations of experience, and remarkably accurate despite lacking scientific explanations. Their understanding of nutrition, medicine, agriculture, and weather was sophisticated and practical. Fifth, they maintained psychological resilience through cultural and religious frameworks that provided meaning and hope. Their worldview acknowledged suffering as inevitable while maintaining faith in the possibility of survival and eventual improvement. This mental toughness was as important as physical resources for long-term survival. The legacy of medieval peasant survival strategies extends far beyond the Dark Ages. Many of the agricultural techniques, herbal remedies, food preservation methods, and community cooperation models they developed continue to be used for centuries. Some are being rediscovered today as people seek more sustainable and resilient ways of living. Their story also reminds us of the incredible human capacity for adaptation and survival. Modern people facing challenges like climate change, economic uncertainty, or social disruption can learn from the resilience, cooperation, and long-term thinking that allowed medieval peasants to survive their own dark ages. The medieval peasants who lived through famines, plagues, and social oppression were our ancestors, not just genetically, but culturally and spiritually. Their struggles, innovations, and survival strategies laid the foundation for everything that came after. They represent both the worst of human suffering and the best of human resilience. Understanding their story helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how much we can learn from their example. In a world that often seems focused on individual achievement and short-term gain, the medieval peasant experience reminds us of the importance of community cooperation, long-term planning, and the fundamental human ability to endure and adapt. They survived so that we could exist. Their legacy isn't found in monuments or written records, but in the simple fact that humanity continued through one of its most challenging periods. Every time we face adversity with determination, cooperate with our neighbors for mutual benefit, or maintain hope despite difficult circumstances, we honor their memory and continue their legacy of survival. The Dark Ages weren't dark because people were ignorant or primitive. They were dark because life was incredibly difficult and uncertain. Yet through skill, cooperation, determination, and remarkable resilience, medieval peasants not only survived, but created the foundation for everything that followed. Their story is ultimately one of triumph, the triumph of human spirit over seemingly impossible circumstances. In our modern world of abundance and security, we can easily forget how precarious survival once was and how much we owe to those who came before us. The medieval peasants who struggled through famines, fought diseases with herbs and hope, and built communities strong enough to endure centuries of hardship were true heroes of human survival. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as history, but as inspiration for facing our own challenges with the same courage, ingenuity, and determination that allowed humanity to survive its darkest ages and emerge into the light of the modern world.